This takes place in March-April of 2013. Me and a friend had just been to the movies and was just walking around at 10:45 p.m. We decided we would take a shortcut through the schoolyard of our old school, which had since been abandoned and was in pretty bad shape. As we walked through the schoolyard, we decided to try to get inside the school building and explore a little bit. Now, the school consists of 2 wings, so the building is an L shape if viewed from above. It is 3 stories tall and has 3 entrances. The main entrance leads into a kind of main hall, which connects the 2 wings. Each wing has staircases in each end of the corridors, which lead to the different floors. This is important later. One of the windows right by the entrance to the lower wing was actually wide open, so we could easily get in. We were now in the basement. We used our cell phones as flashlights and made sure not to point them towards the windows to avoid being seen. Even though the building was not in use, there was still a lot of stuff left just laying around. Musical equipment, uniforms, a pool table, chairs, etc. So we were just exploring each room in the basement to see if we could find anything cool. We explored the basement for about 15 minutes before we headed up to the first floor, and we were now in the main hall. There was some kind of tarp or large plastic sheet hanging there to separate the hall and the lower wing for some reason. I assume it was for some kind of construction work. We went down one of the corridors and started exploring the classrooms. Every classroom had been either vandalized or suffered some kind of water damage, so everything was pretty broken down and rotting. In hindsight, I think we were lucky the floors didn't collapse on us or something. We had just come out of the 3rd classroom and were in the corridor when we heard someone moving the tarp/plastic sheet in the main hall. This was not wind or anything. We could definitely tell someone was physically moving it. We could also hear footsteps, although the rhythm of the steps was kind of weird. It sounded like someone changed their walking pace sporadically, if that makes any sense. We immediately went inside a classroom to hide, as we thought someone had called security on us. We hid behind the door in the classroom for about 2 minutes, dead quiet. We didn't hear anything else during this time, so we figured it had to be the wind or just random noises. We decided to keep going. We went through the corridor and up the stairs in the other end from the main hall and explored the 2nd floor. While we were there, we would occasionally hear some noises, but we just brushed it off as wind. After a while, we had explored the rest of the corridor, and we decided to walk down the staircase that lead from the 2nd floor to the hall. Halfway down the staircase there was this plateau before the 2nd set of stairs, and this is where things took a turn, no pun intended. We could see the plastic from there, and it was moving. We also heard some kind of scratching noise. We stood there for a second just listening, and I decided to peek around the corner to see what was making that sound. What I saw scared the living shit out of me. It was some kind of creature. It was skinny, almost completely naked, couldn't see any clothes at least, had really thin strands of hair, and was really pale. Like corpse pale, almost completely white. The first thing that came to mind was that this thing looked like Gollum, just bigger. It was crouching down and was scratching the floor or something, and it made some weird growl, groan, breathy noises. It was facing away from us, so I just stood frozen for a good while and watched it. I took a step back and just pointed at this thing and looked at my friend. He peeked around the corner and immediately I could see his facial expression change into a combination of horror and shock. It was reassuring in a way, knowing that he saw it too. We just stood there for a good 20 seconds just watching this thing do whatever it was doing, and the most cliché horror movie thing happened. My friend started backing away slowly, and while doing so stepped on a piece of glass that cracked. This startled the creature, and it quickly looked over its shoulder right at me. I just bolted at that point. We ran all the way to the basement to get out, and the whole way there I swear it felt like it was right behind us. We ran back to my friend's house, and when we got there we had a kind of debriefing session, making sure we both saw the same thing. The closest thing to a reference picture I can find is this. It pretty much looked exactly like that, just with thin strands of hair on its head. I understand if you think I'm bullshitting. I would be skeptical if someone else told this story. But I swear this actually happened, and my friend confirms it to this day. We got a good enough look at it to confirm that it was a humanoid creature of some sorts, but it didn't really resemble a human being. The only explanation I can think of is that it was a homeless dude that for some reason was naked in this abandoned school, but this is in northern Norway during winter. You wouldn't survive very long without clothes. Also, I live in a very small town with very few, if any, homeless people, so that theory wouldn't really make sense. It could also be some kind of animal that had found its way inside, but we got a good look at it, and it didn't resemble any animal I've seen before. I have no idea what that thing was. I am normally a rational / Occam's razor kind of person, but we saw what we saw and I have no explanation for it. When I was about 8 years old, I was taking my dog for a walk through the neighborhood with my mom. It was maybe 11 p.m. We live next to a swamp/woods area on the edge of our neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan. I remember it being very silent and slightly windy. From down in the swamp we heard somebody whistling at us. It sounded sort of like a bird, but each whistle was different enough where the lack of consistency made it human-like. The whistle sounded higher, then lower. I can't really describe it. My mom had a concerned, slightly terrified look on her face and grabbed my hand and said that we should go inside quickly. I didn't understand because I was too young, but seeing my mom freak out made me freak out too. After a while, though, I kind of forgot about it. 2 years later, I was taking my dog out again, late at night. There's a large bush that could easily obscure a person behind it just next to the front door. As I was finishing the walk, the whistling noise started again, same pitches, same inconsistent, human-like tones. As soon as I heard it, a chill went down my spine as I remembered exactly the feeling of seeing my mom, terrified, looking down into the swamp at something I couldn't see. Maybe she couldn't either. I ran inside as fast as possible. Years went by and I thought about it less and less. I told only a handful of people, and eventually it slipped from my mind. Fast forward to last summer, I'm 24, started dating my girl Sarah. We moved out to South Dakota for work. For Independence Day, we decided to go to Pierre, South Dakota, and watch the fireworks along the bank of the Missouri River. There was a free camping spot behind a hospital where you could pitch your tent, hang out, and see the fireworks up the river. We were near the end of the campground and there were very few people around us. As it was getting dark, the fireworks began. They were pretty far away, so the illumination they brought was very little. Thus, we had to sit right at the edge of the river to be able to see them. A huge thunderhead was moving in and a storm was imminent, so the air seemed electric and the wind was picking up. The atmosphere was eerie to say the least. The police boats herded all the other boats off of the river and had left our area to do that elsewhere. Most of the other campers walked up the river to have a better view of the fireworks, but Sarah and I stayed back and were drinking PBR Tallboys and kicking it. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a paddle methodically dipping into the water. We saw a figure steering a canoe about 20 m offshore. Sarah decided to go get more beers from the car, leaving me alone to stare at this mystery person. And then, of course, they whistled at me. My entire body was frozen and covered in goosebumps. It was the exact same whistler from my childhood, more than a decade earlier. I looked at the figure, but it was much too dark to discern who it could be. They were wearing a hat. When they were perpendicular to the shore from me, they stopped paddling, turned the canoe to face directly at me, and whistled right at me. I was so frightened I stood up and shouted at them, "Who are you?" They didn't say anything, just whistled a couple more times, turned the canoe 180 degrees, and paddled out of sight. I'm a videographer, so I already had my camera by my side and was taking video of the fireworks. As the canoe was almost out of sight, I grabbed my camera and got a shot of them whistling as they went away. When Sarah came back from getting beers, she was very confused as to why I was so freaked out. When I explained, she was freaked out a bit too. I was convinced we would both be murdered that night. How did this whistling person follow me, after 14 years, all the way to South Dakota? Was it a coincidence? Why was it the same whistling noise? Who was that person and where did they go? So many questions still unanswered. To this day, I'm more afraid of being outside in the dark where I might hear that whistling again. Back in the early 1990s, I was a kid, around 13 at the time of this incident, and I used to stay at my grandparents' house a lot out in a very rural area in S.E., Arkansas. When I say very rural, I mean it was a series of networked dirt roads to get out to their house. The closest neighbors besides my aunt and uncle, who lived about a quarter of a mile up the road, was over 1.5 miles away. This was very backwoods and isolated from most civilization. The closest town was a 10-mile trip. It's in the middle of farmland and mostly woods. They had lived in this house since my mother was a child, and had both grown up just a ways down the road. Anyways, there was a general store roughly 3 to 4 miles down the network of dirt roads. This was your typical country general store ran by an old lady and her husband, and its only customers really only consisted of the people who lived out there in BFE. One day my grandmother asked me if I wanted to walk to the general store and get her some milk, eggs, a few other miscellaneous items, and I told her I would. She gave me some money and I headed on my way. It was fairly early in the day and I had plenty of time to get back before dark, which I always made sure to do when I was out roaming about. Things can get mighty creepy out in the backwoods of Arkansas after nightfall. It's a darkness unlike most people who have lived primarily in cities or towns have ever experienced. Me, being a 13-year-old, had poor time management skills. I stopped at the bottom of a hill next to this small wooden bridge you have to cross and messed around at the creek catching crawdads and such, and I kinda just messed around the whole way to the store. By the time I left the store, I realized it was quickly approaching dark. This was fall and darkness set upon the land pretty early in the day. I didn't want to be walking those lonely, secluded roads through the woods alone in the dark, so I hurried as fast as I could, running and sprinting as much as possible. But it wasn't enough. By the time I had made it back to the bottom of the hill near the bridge, it was almost completely dark, and there was an eerie sort of glow brought about by a very bright, nearly full moon that was rising. At the top of the hill, the road was perfectly straight and flat, with woods on the left side and a large field on the right. About 1/2 mile up from the top of the hill is my grandparents' house, and you can see it from there. As I top the hill, I can see the faint glow of the lights at their house, and I feel a sense of relief because I was kind of freaking out a little bit, but knowing I was so close and could see the house offered a little bit of comfort. The field on the right was somewhat illuminated by the glow of the moon, and my eyes had adjusted to the darkness rather well at this point. As I walked up the road, I hear something from the left, behind me on the wooded side of the road. It sounded like leaves being rustled. I turned to look and see nothing at first, but then as my eyes begin to focus, I see something in the ditch, a black shadowy shape slowly moving towards me. At first I thought it was a dog, but then realized it was much too large to be a dog, and then I realized it wasn't actually walking on 4 legs, it was crawling, like a person would. I stared for a moment, out of sheer confusion, trying to figure out what I was seeing, and then a jolt of fear shot through me as it dawned on me that whatever this thing was, it had been trying to sneak up on me. At that exact moment, this thing stood upright out of the ditch on 2 legs, like a person. It had the shape of a human, long arms, legs, and was proportioned as such. It stood roughly 7 to 8 feet in height and was completely covered in black or maybe dark brown hair. Its face was dark in color, and I can't recall seeing much in the way of features due to it being night. It was no bear for certain, or any other kind of animal I have ever seen for that matter. I immediately dropped the bag of stuff I had been carrying and bolted as fast as my legs could take me towards my grandparents' house. I heard a heavy breathing / guttural growling kind of sound behind me and heard this thing's footsteps running behind me on the gravel as it gave chase. I did not turn around and was certain that it would grab me at any moment. I then heard it crash off into the woods and let out an earth-shattering and ungodly scream unlike anything I had ever heard before or since. I'm positive this thing could have easily caught me had it wanted to, but for some reason it let me go. By the time I reached my grandparents, my heart felt as if it would explode from the combination of the adrenaline rush I had from being scared beyond any type of fear I had ever felt before or since, and full on sprinting as hard and fast as possible for about a half straight mile. I flew into the house and in an incoherent mess of hyperactive gibberish tried to explain to my grandparents what had just happened. My grandmother didn't really seem to believe me, but did believe something had scared me and acted rather weird about the whole thing. She tried to convince me it was just a dog or some other animal. The next morning I woke up and found my grandpa sitting outside whittling wood underneath the shade tree in the front yard, as he often liked to do. I went and sat down beside him in one of the old metal lawn chairs. He was a very rational man, down to earth, and had grown up in and hunted that area his entire life. He knew every square inch of it, mapped into his mind. He knew every type of critter and creature that lived in those woods, what noise they made, where to find them, how to catch them, etc. I had only been hunting with him for a couple of years, but had been going out into those woods with him since a pretty young age on walks and such. He had passed a lot of his knowledge down to me during those adventures. I spoke to him about what had happened to me the night before and told him that I knew what I saw. It wasn't my overactive imagination, I wasn't making it up, and it definitely wasn't a dog. He knew that I wasn't just some dumb 13-year-old kid, and he knew that I knew the things he taught me. He stopped whittling, looked me right in the eyes, and said, "I know what you saw. I've seen it before too. There's things out in them woods that people don't understand, and that a person ought not go fooling with." I remember those words clearly to this day, because it gave me affirmation, but at the same time made me realize that whatever I'd seen was very real in existence and beyond my understanding. My grandpa then went on to tell me that far back in the woods, there are some cliffs, and at the bottom of those cliffs is a cave. He told me that the cave is where the creature lived. He had once stumbled upon it a long time ago when he was hunting. He said he was standing on the top of the cliff looking at it when a creature fitting the same description emerged and began screaming wildly at him and throwing rocks. He said he took a shot at it, missed, and then this thing gave chase to him. But my grandpa was on top of the cliff, so in order to get to him this thing had to go around a pretty good distance and then up, which he said it quickly began to do, so he hightailed it out of there in a hurry. He said the whole way back home he felt as if he were being watched and kept hearing twigs snap behind him, and he was certain that it was following him, stalking him. He made it home, and as he reached his front porch he turned and looked back at the woods from where he'd came and saw it peeking out at him from behind a tree. Later that night he said that he and my grandmother awoke in the early morning hours to large rocks being thrown at the house and ungodly howling noises from outside and this thing trying to get into the house. He said he could hear it walking around on the front porch, rattling the doorknobs, banging on windows, and it sounded like it was muttering to itself in a low, deep, garbled voice, but it didn't sound like a language, just a bunch of gibberish. After a while the thing went back to throwing some more rocks and howling, so my grandpa grabbed his shotgun and fired it out the front door a few times into the darkness and the direction of the howling and said he heard it run back into the woods. He didn't know if he'd hit it or not. He said that was the last he'd ever seen or heard from it, but over the years an occasional farmer's cow would be mutilated, or someone's hunting dog would go unexplainably missing, or someone would have a story about some strange creature they'd seen. He also said it scared my grandmother beyond words, and she absolutely has refused to ever talk about it or even acknowledge that it happened. Which explains her acting weird about it when I told her what happened to me. I know it's a pretty far-fetched story, and you can believe it or not. It makes no difference to me. I know what I saw and my grandpa knew what he saw, and neither of us had ever felt the need to convince anyone else of it. In fact, until today, I have never actually spoken of it to anyone other than my grandpa, and he passed away roughly 10 years ago. I work in a pub. It's about 2 miles away in the next village. I usually finish work late, 1 to 2 a.m., and I have to cycle home. The only route is a small road that goes through somewhat large woods. There's a 1-mile stretch that has absolutely no street lights. It's pitch black. As I was cycling through the woods, I start hearing this screeching sound, similar to a small animal dying. It scared the shit out of me, so I started pedaling fast. I continued to hear it, and it seemed as it was progressing towards me. I use my phone's camera light to navigate, although it isn't impossible to see without it. I point my phone behind me and I swear I caught sight of some fucking humanoid creature on all fours running at me. Call it mind games, but this was pretty vivid. I continue to cycle as fast as I can. I've been cycling long distances from a young age. I'd like to say I'm quite fast. Yet I continue to hear the screeching and the light padding of the footsteps of whatever is chasing me. I try to turn my phone light off, and after a few seconds I manage to do so. The padding becomes quieter, and I hear one last screech from whatever it was. I have never been so scared in all my life. Edit. Okay, I've called up the pub manager for some more work. He asked me in for a shift tonight. I'll take pictures tonight. They'll be posted when this post is about 13 hours old. I'll let you guys know what happens on my way back. Edit. Just leaving now. Wish me luck. Edit. I said I'd deliver. Well, fuck me. I took some pictures of my cycle home to try and verify the story as much as possible. I'm pretty shaken at the moment, as I'll explain below. So on my way home, I was absolutely shitting myself. As it's the only reasonable route home, I had to do it, and sooner than later, so here I was, beginning the long journey home. As I went further in, it opens up to a connecting road, which is quite open, although it has woods either side. I very rarely see cars on this road, and I don't recall seeing any at night time. After cycling for a few minutes, I heard the same scream I heard a month back. I was fucking scared. The first time wasn't just some stupid coincidence. It sounded far away, and didn't seem as though it was directed towards me. I kept my light off this time, except for taking pictures. I assumed whatever it was didn't see me, but I began to fucking pump it home. This is when it gets bad. Throughout the forest, in all directions, I heard what must have been at least 10 other screams, all sounding exactly the same, all in harmony. I honestly thought that was it. I thought I was dead any second. I'm so fucking happy to be home, and I fucking delivered. I don't know what this is, but I don't want to fuck with them. Sometime in 2002, I hear this ungodly noise outside my front door. Sounds like a cross between a barking dog and a cat being strangled. It must be said that I live in town that is bang in the middle of a large forest, so wildlife is the norm. So I head outside and find a very small deer stuck in the metal fence. It was one of those fences with large square sections, and this little guy got his head in there, but his horns acted as barbs and he was going nowhere. Later learned it was a male muntjac, quite a terrifying looking little shit, horns, tusks, but utterly harmless. Well, I decide it can't stay there, and if I simply free it, there is a real risk it will get hit by a car. I'm maybe half a mile from the deep forest edge, so I free it, pick it up, and start carrying it to the forest. For a start, that little deer is heavy as hell, and I didn't notice at the time, but he had cut himself up pretty bad trying to get out of that fence. He fought almost the entire way, kicking and bucking his head back to the point I figured the authorities would eventually find me with a deer's horns stuck in my forehead, but I carried on. By the time I get to the forest, I am exhausted and covered in blood. Walking into the forest, I notice this deer is fucked. It can barely move. It isn't fighting anymore. I put him down and he doesn't even attempt to run, and I figure if I just leave him, he's going to be something's dinner by the end of the night, and I'll be damned if I have just carried a deer half a mile to deliver it to predators. So I ran back home, grabbed a couple bottles of water, then ran back, and there he is, still there and gasping. I sat next to that deer and started giving him sips of water from my hand and cleaning the wound on his neck. His fur was falling off in my hands to the extent his entire neck was almost bald and red raw where he had been trying to get out of that fence, but I cleaned it pretty good. After about 2 hours of me sitting there with that deer's head in my lap and giving him water, he straight leaped up and started to run off. Now I'd love to say he stopped a few yards away and turned to nod at me or some other bullshit, but he just pegged it without looking back deeper into the forest. I kinda shrugged, got up, brushed myself off, and walked home feeling quite good about myself, to be honest. Where's the creepy bit? It's coming. About 18 months later, I'm walking in the forest as part of my daily after-work routine. I walk the same route every evening for about 4 miles before dinner, and when I get back home, have quite the appetite. At no point in the years I have been walking that route have I come across anything other than the odd roe deer, a badger running away, or maybe a fox running across the trail. I come around a corner onto my homeward bound trail and disturb the biggest fucking badger I have ever seen. This thing was huge. Normally, they leg it as soon as they see a person, but this fellow was having none of it and started running towards me, making the most awful huffing noise. I'm thinking, honestly, killed by a poxy badger, when I hear this rustle in the forest in front of me and something I thought was a dog comes out of nowhere, runs past me at a good rate of knots. I stop to turn around and this weird dog plows this badger straight in the face, hits it so hard it ends up knocked off the trail. By this point, I am honestly in a WTF state. The badger that was just chasing me is now running down the trail being chased and randomly rammed by the weirdest dog in history. Eventually, it runs into the woods and this dog gallops back towards me and stops about 20 meters away. Clearly not a dog. A very odd-looking little deer with a somewhat bald patch still around his neck.